Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for coming for this lovely afternoon sessions on intellectual development in the Arab world. And we have four distinguished speakers of very different, or rather similar fields, different and similar, and who will be speaking about different aspects of intellectual development in the Arab world. I think it's going to be a fascinating afternoon. Our first speaker will be Dr. Sune Haugbolle, from the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. He's an assistant professor of Arabic, and he did his BA at the Copenhagen University and his MA and PhD at Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford University. Graduated in 2006, and his published works, one of them is titled War and Memory in Lebanon, and the other on the politics of violence, truth, and reconciliation in the Arab Middle East. And indeed, Lebanon is a fascinating case study in this matter. At the moment, he's working on ideology, media, especially with an emphasis on the Arab left. And Dr. Haugbolle will speak on the Arab left and ideology studies, convergences, and cross-fertilizations. Okay.
Sort out the practicals. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to this panel. I met Rami in Oxford last summer, and we started chatting about the Arab left and different historical work that he has done and that's in process. And so it kind of dovetailed a bit with what I'm starting to work on, which is the Arab left and leftism, and what leftism means in an Arab context. And I've worked on this project for about a year, so it's work in progress. And I thought what I could do with my talk here is to offer some general outlines of how we can study ideology and leftism and what it means, and then maybe this can help us have a focused discussion. That's to say that I'm not actually delving so much into the specifics of my findings so far, but more the sort of conceptual lines. So I'd like to start with, since we're talking about transition at this conference, I'd like to make a reference to the Egyptian revolution, first of all. I think, a lot of commentators have talked about the non-ideological manner in which these demonstrators came forward, that it had nothing to do with Arab nationalism or ideologies in general, or Islamism. And I think there's some truth in that. But at the same time, I also recognized and saw a lot of references to a past and sort of leftist past in the signs and in the songs and in the slogans of some of the demonstrators. And many of these were new songs, but some of them were also older songs, and some of them were by one of the guys that I'm studying, which pleased me. And his name is Sheikh Imam. Some of you might know him. And he was a singer in the 70s and was quite popular. And now he's become even more popular. And if you go to his Facebook page, he has 1 million fans now, and people post his songs, and they kind of mirror themselves and their experience today in these songs from the 70s. And what can explain this continued relevance of Sheikh Imam? I mean, after all, this is quite old stuff. And what I would point to is his access to subaltern aesthetics and discourse. And this is far from the case, far from always the case for those who pertain to speak on behalf of the less articulated. I mean, this is what a leftist is supposed to do. But they don't always get it right. And if you look at Islamist intellectuals, they often point out, when they want to explain why the Arab left failed from the 50s onwards, is that there was a distance between intellectuals and ordinary people. This is what many Islamists say. Now, this is also sometimes a self-criticism among leftists. So there's a brilliant article on Sheikh Imam. This is the only thing written, by the way, on him. It's by a woman called Marilyn Booth, whom I deeply admire. And she quotes someone. She quotes an Egyptian veteran activist talking about Sheikh Imam, and he said, unquote, they were the oral facet of the leftist movement. and therefore their impact was huge. So unlike the political movement of the Egyptian left, which has failed in many ways, you have these organic intellectuals, if you want, who articulate what leftism is really about. So the guy says, unlike the political movement, which was basically, fundamentally a movement of intellectuals. So here, intellectuals is sort of a bad thing, if you want. So this was not the champagne socialists, and it was not the over-theorizing Marxist or post-Marxist camp of the Arab left, but Sheikh Imam and others with him, other popular artists with him, like the cartoonist, which many of you would know, I work on, called Naji al-Ali, singers like Masel Khalifi and Ziad Rahbani. They were organic intellectuals who kept the causes and images that are dear to ordinary people in close purview. Or at least this is how they were seen and are seen by many Arab leftists who mirror themselves in their work. And that's the kind of leftism that I'm after in my research. I look at how icons of Arab leftism are used to formulate what leftism means today. And so this is a project that started, as I said, before the revolutions began, but I see now that its relevance is perhaps growing because I think leftism has been discounted as something quite dead and gone in this part of the world and perhaps elsewhere. And I think we see a recurrence of forms of leftism at least. But what does all this mean? And what do I mean with all this leftism? I'm going to explain myself and make it more clear. Now, as a scholar, my background is someone who has studied social memory. I've been interested in the way that societies remember historical facts and how that's constructed through cultural artifacts, the circulation of different material, memories, and things like that. As Liat mentioned, I published a book last year called War and Memory in Lebanon, and it looks at how the civil war in Lebanon has been remembered and how that created a particular politics as well. So I'm trying to apply the same social processes and mechanisms in ideology, in studying ideology. My question is, how is ideology produced through interaction with historical experience? And for me, ideology is an important field in Middle East studies because we always talk about ideology. It's always invoked to explain society and politics in the Middle East. And there are two tropes in particular that recur, that I find recur, implicitly or explicitly. And the one is that the secular Arab ideologies have declined since the 1970s, and that Islamic revivalist ideologies have become the new hegemonic force. And for me, the problem is that these broad observations have actually not been sufficiently substantiated by studies of what ideology is, how it works, how it's produced. And I hope to add to that. Now, ideology in the Middle East has mostly been studied through the prisms of intellectual and political history. We know that ideology made its entry in the late Ottoman period during the so-called Nahda period, the reawakening period. Classic studies show how what Gramsci would call organic intellectuals and the great intellectuals gave birth to nationalism, Arabism, and Islamism. So Hassan al-Banna could be an example of an organic intellectual, and the great intellectuals could be the Nahda intellectuals that Albert Hourani writes about in his classic work. If we look at the period after the Second World War, Arab nationalism, Marxism, Baathism, socialist ideologies informed the post-colonial Arab republics and also broad swathes of intellectual life. And these ideas were inspired by forms of Western modernism, and you know they had their own formulation in the Arab context, but they were inspired by Western modernism. You have strands of tiers-mondism, social distribution policies, state centralization, and this was, of course, also a reaction to Western colonialism. So there was a doubleness in it, trying to formulate it yourself and trying to take inspiration. Nationalism, Arab unification, social justice, and the Palestinian cause had, of course, mass appeal beyond the Arab intelligentsia. This was not just a case of a few intellectuals. So being a leftist, a Yazari, emerged as a social identification throughout the Arab countries. If we look at this period, the post-colonial period. So who was a Yazidi? Well, a Yazidi, a leftist, was a secular believer in modernization. He often saw himself as opposed to the bourgeois westernized classes who dominated Arab societies in the first part of the 20th century. And he was different because he identified with the common people, with the ordinary people, and he was preoccupied with social justice in the Arab countries and in the world. He's just like the working class heroes that we find in Sheikh Imam's songs. He was often funny and able to see through the facade of society. So often you find the word shadir in Arabic, meaning someone who's clever in the way that he can see through and grasp reality behind things, be critical. Now, since the high tide of the Arab left under Jamal Abdel Nasser, the influence of secular leftism has waned. The decline of leftist parties has coincided with a religious revival in the Middle East, and that has given strength and support to Islamist groups. And as a consequence of the Islamist revival, the Islamic revival, ideology in the Middle East is today mainly examined from the vantage point of the Islamic revival, or as a competition between secular and Islamist tendencies. Yeah? So we often talk about it as here's the secular and here's the Islamist, and never shall the twain meet, so that kind of thing. I would like to challenge that approach a bit, and in order to do so, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the debates that determine the way that we understand what ideology is. So I'm going to do it a bit like a 101 of ideology studies. I think that's kind of useful, so for myself. And to show how many facets of ideology that there actually are and how many we're missing out on in our field in the way we talk about ideology. Ideology sprang out of the economic, social, and political upheavals through which the modern world took shape, and it's been intimately involved in the continuing process of social transformation and political development. Earlier approaches to ideology viewed ideology much like culture, something like a bounded human group characterized by a high degree of cultural homogeneity. Here you would have the communists, here you would have the Islamists, here you would have the Zionists, and so on. In contrast, the way that most anthropologists and social historians today look at ideology is informed by the insights of constructivist and linguistic turns in the social sciences in the last 3 decades. So rather than looking for boundedness, social historians see the existence of community as a result of particular work that's aiming at producing internal coherence. So I would say that just like cultures, ideologies cannot be taken for pre-given. They must be critically deconstructed and contextualized when we study them historically, and also today. So this is true for the study of contemporary ideology, because the 20th century may have been the age of extremes, like Hobsbawm's famous book puts it, a competition between fascism, Nazism, socialism, nationalism, communism, and capitalism. But when we look at the world today, I think things are changing, like the former speaker was saying. We're looking at a more fluid picture. And I don't agree with those who say that after the Cold War, ideology was dead. I mean, that's a sort of a famous take on it, because things are more fluid. It means that ideology doesn't mean anything. We live in a post-ideological age. There's a very good theorist called Michael Frieden who's countered this, and I'm sort of copying him here. And I think it's very relevant for our topic, namely the current transitions in the Middle East. Is it or is it not driven by ideology, by particular convictions, by particular rhetorics? Which ideologies are left from the 20th century, and what do they mean today? Do they mean the same as they did before? And I think this is really, really important when we talk about Islamism, because certain people tend to read Islamism in a very textual way. So Hassan al-Banna is a textbook to understanding the minds of Islamists. You can go back and read the text from 1920, and then you know exactly what the Muslim Brotherhood thinks today. So Michael Frieden, I mentioned, who's the most influential writer on ideology today, has stressed that in our age of what he calls ostensible liberalist hegemony, a number of new ideologies continue to emerge, and older ideologies break up or regroup. So we have a fluidity of the ideology landscape, and that does pose a lot of challenges to understanding what ideology is today. So the traditional categorization of ideologies in terms of a political spectrum from left to right wing, which, by the way, goes back to the seating arrangements during the French Revolution, where the right and the left bench, has given way to perspectives inspired by discourse analysis, cultural studies, and anthropology, which look more at how ideologies are constructed in everyday life and public spheres. And this is an important shift, yeah, because if you look at classic foundational texts of ideology, you get a very different, more static picture than if you look at how, or if you try to understand the quite complicated processes of how ideologies are produced. So if we take this as good and true, that ideologies change and blend and lend from each other, their emergence and development must be understood more in terms of opposition, discontinuities, contradictions, fluidity, and first of all, transition and transformation. And ideological transformations are shaped by international, national events, funding structures, institutions, media, but most of all by the way that people understand the world, the way hermeneutic processes, I guess, including the way that we make sense of the past. And I think if we accept that fluidity of the ideology landscape, it means that we must abandon the idea that ideologies are finite and cohesive, complete, and instead we must understand the process of boundary making between ideological clusters, the rewriting and rereading of it. So, all that kind of theoretical stuff, what does that mean for the Middle East and for us in Middle East studies? Well, I think these ideas challenged prevalent notions about the nature and role of ideology in Arab societies and in regional politics and culture. And I think the crucial problem concerning ideology studies of the Middle East is that scholars have tended to separate Islamist and secular positions too neatly. And if we take the crudest version of this, we get a kind of a zero-sum game where the Arab East today has turned its back completely on modern advances in the 20th century and gone back to a kind of a pre-modern culturalist mode of Islamic politics. I'm thinking of Bernard Lewis. You could also take someone like Olivier Roy, who writes a book called Secularism Confronts Islam. So you have this and a sort of a clash between the two in the world at large. And I think the problem with, these are great scholars in many ways, both of them. But I think the problem is with that reading that it assumes a cohesiveness of secularism and Islamism that actually becomes quite untenable if you look at it at closer inspection. And what I mean closer inspection is we look at Arab societies and what actually is happening. And so the very idea that secularism is a separate ideology often obfuscates more than it clarifies social reality. I could mention recent ethnographies like the work of Samouli Schilke, for example, in Egypt, that clearly show it's too facile to say that the Middle East is caught up in a culture war of two opposites that disregard each other's basic premises. Actually, for most ordinary Arabs, people in Arab societies, Islam may be a cornerstone of Arab cultural identity more than it was 30 years ago. We need to accept that. But this kind of Islamic leaning does not preclude leftist positions and ambitions for democratic change, social justice, liberal stances, or even secularization. Islamist and secular positions are not mutually exclusive. And this is not something I'm coming up with. This is something you can definitely point to. Thanks. There are many shades of Islamism, and some of them display anti-secular stances, others take inspiration from and work with secular leftist groups. And we can also see that there are many secular Islamist coalitions in countries like, Morocco, Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And I think the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt have shown these spectrums and overlaps if we weren't aware of them already. Okay, I'm running a bit out of time, so just bear with me for a minute when I see what I want to tell you. Well, I do want to tell you that I think that there is something left of the Arab left. Yasar al-Arabi and being leftist are good categories for me to work with, much better than a secularist, because they mean something. These are vernacular terms that have a life and have a history. And so the challenge for us, I think, and I hope we can start talking about this, is to how in Middle East studies we can start having a proper research agenda looking into what leftism means today. And that's very connected to the historical challenges. There is important work now coming out, particularly on the Arab communist parties. And Rami is one of the prominent people in it. You could point to Orit Bashkin as well. And so there's a historiography of the Arab left that needs to be written, but there's also, I hope, need for the kind of ethnographic work that I'm trying to do, understanding how is leftist ideology today formulated. I'll cut it short here, and maybe we can return to some of the points I left out in my in the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haugbolle, for a great introduction to the question of how we should reconceptualize how we view the Arab world today. I think there's a lot of confusion in the last couple of weeks of how do we deal with our old categories and how do we create a new ones. And I think putting that on the table in the beginning of the panel is a very important contribution, which I think will come up in the other lectures and the question and answer session later. Our next speaker is Professor Rami Ginat. Professor Rami Ginat is a professor of Middle Eastern and international relations in Bar-Ilan political science department. All of us are familiar, most of us are familiar with his work on the history of Egyptian communism. He published 2 recent books, one on the history of Egyptian communism, Jews and their compatriots in quest of revolution, and the other is titled Egypt and the Second Palestinian Intifada, Policymaking and Multifaceted Commitments. His lecture today is about the Arab left, a retrospective analysis.
Thank you very much for coming this very difficult time. Also would like to thank the organizer of this conference for inviting me once again. It became like a tradition in the last years, and I'm very pleased to be here, mainly enjoying the beautiful view that you've got here. I'm actually going to talk about the Arab left from the past point of view, the achievements of the Arab left. And just to start with, I would say that Arab left, or the Arab left, started or emerged in the early 20th century, and there was a continuity to this day. The emphasis should be on the relevancy of the Arab left, and I think that the most important period will actually be the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which I'm going to talk about today. Basically, the Arab left has always been small in terms size-wise, split organizationally, yet its impact upon the political and social developments of Arab countries was beyond all proportions. In my paper, I will divide the history of the Arab left into several phases, historically, and discuss the content of each one of them. One may use the phrase rise and fall in reference to the Arab left in order to depict this development. Also, it is noteworthy that we cannot actually speak of the Arab left as homogeneous and unified group, neither ideologically nor organizationally. In fact, the left, I would say, covered a very wide spectrum from moderate nationalist socialism to very radical internationalist communism. In my short presentation, as I said, I will focus mainly on 2 countries whom I researched in the past, Egypt and Syria. I would start by saying the first stage is takes us to the first 2 decades of the 20th century with the emergence of a socialist thought. And this was actually started with the appearance of the intellectual Shibli Shumail, who was a firm believer in science and socialism and envisioned a universal society based on harmony among nations inspired by science. Shumail laid the foundations to a new school of socialism that, despite its lack of immediate success, had long-term repercussions. Among his disciples were people like Salama Musa, Mustafa Hassanan al-Mansouri, and Nicola al-Haddad, very important intellectuals. I will start by saying a few words about Haddad. Al-Haddad views socialism as something that basically rejecting the notions of gradual reforms. It shouldn't be based on reforms within the existing socio-political system, but rather he called for fully control of the means of productions for the sake of the whole nations. He emphasized the principle that political democracy should precede socialism, since therefore the government therefore should be elected. Salama Musa, unlike Haddad, believed in graduality. He was actually embodied a combination, let's say, of Fabianism, Marxism, and Darwinism. He was a very important intellectual, and he was also active not only in the first person actually to write a book on socialism in 1930, but he was also active politically and was the organizer, among the founders of the Socialist Party in 1921. Another intellectual, Hassanan al-Mansouri, was also very important because he was somebody that actually introduced the new form of nationalist Marxism, which was later adopted by Arab intellectuals, mainly Egyptians, in the 1960s, the group of Al-Taliya and Lutfi al-Khuli. Both al-Mansouri and al-Haddad actually formulated socialist ideas in Arabic, and it was actually spread all over the Arab world. They both actually attracted the following, despite their lack of attention to issues of strategy because they addressed the fundamental injustices in the prevailing social and economic conditions. Unlike Salama Musa, who was a theoretician and politician that was involved directly with organized socialism, Al-Haddad and Mansouri remain mainly within the framework of theoretical works. The second stage, maybe I would say the first steps of organized communism, socialism, were laid in the 1920s, early 1920s, mainly by foreigners. And in the case of Egypt, the founding father of communism was somebody called Joseph Rosenthal, a Jew, who emigrated to Egypt in the late 19th century. And Joseph Rosenthal was not only important in the establishing the links with the Comintern in the early 20s, he was also very, very important in establishing the labor movement in Egypt, even before the admission to the Comintern. Established lots of labor, trade unions and others, so he was quite a significant figure, although he was expelled from the party in the early 20s, 1923 actually, but his influence was very much beyond it. Organized communism was also linked to the Comintern in the 1920s and 1930s. I would say that during that period we could see a great influence of foreigners who acted amicably with the Egyptians' compatriots. Lots of them were Jews who were later expelled to the former Soviet Union, and after settling there for a while, they became victims of the Stalinist purges in the late 1930s. The 1940s, the late 1930s, mainly the early 1940s, saw the emergence of what are defined as a homemade brand of communism, where, again, Jews featured very prominently. Just to mention the case of Syria and Lebanon, in the mid-1920s, the Communist Party was actually developed, it emerged as a development from within, but also there was a gentleman called Joseph Barzilai Berger, if you heard of him, who was sent from Palestine to Syria in order to help with the organization of the party. And that Barzilai himself was also after that a victim of these Stalinist purges, but he survived it and wrote a very interesting book, The Tragedy of the Soviet Revolution. Again, as I said before, Jews featured prominently in the foundations of the communist movement in the early 1940s. There were lots of reasons which I won't be able to specify here. And they were very active. In fact, 4 organizations were established in the early 1940s, particularly following the great victory of the Soviets in Stalingrad. And I would just say a few words on their achievements in the 1940s. They gave considerable attention to issues related to economy and social justice. Through such prominent theoretical communist forums such as Al-Fajr al-Gadid and Al-Gemahir, that's in Egypt, they published a wide range of articles analyzing the troubled state of Egyptian society and offering socialist solutions to its problems. These magazines were very critical, pointing out the many flaws in the ruling capitalist feudal system. Communists writing in these magazines, like many of their counterparts worldwide, saw themselves as the crossroad of uniquely significant historical events. In their view, the collapse of fascism and Nazism was a watershed in human history, inaugurating a new era of socialism throughout the world. Rifat al-Said, the renowned historians of the Communist Party in Egypt, actually summarized the achievements of the communist movement in that country, saying, he was also a member of one of them, Hadeto, the Egyptian Marxist, and I agree with him, by the way, the Egyptian Marxists who had been active in the 1940s and 1950s had scored significant political achievements, which later seeped into government policy and thinking. As an example, he cited the principle of armed struggle against the British, which the Marxists advanced in the 1940s, and it became a reality in the late 1950s and late 1951, early 1952, with the clashes against the guerrilla warfare against the British along the canal. The original text, he said, of the Free Officers Organization's platform was drafted by Khaled Muhyiddin, who had direct ties with Hadeto. He's still, I don't know if he's still alive, but he was a member of a later version of a socialist group, Tagamu. And this Khaled ad-Din had at some point been a member of Iskra in the past as well. Nasser advanced the Agrarian Reform Bill, in the preparation of which Ahmed Fuad, a member of the Central Committee of Hadeto and the figure responsible for overseeing relations with the army, had been an active participant. Nasser even adopted the communist stance vis-à-vis the Sudan in the monarchy period especially in the first part of the 1920s, there was a consensus among Egyptian nationalists that Egypt and Sudan should be one entity, and there was a whole discourse within Egyptian intellectuals and politicians calling the Wahdat Wadi al-Nil, the unity of the Nile Valley. But the communists were the only group who were actually in opposition to this idea, and they were actually swimming against the nationalist current, and consequently, they suffered for that. But the military regime who took over in 1952 actually adopted their formula. And Sudan was actually, they reached an agreement in 1953 with the British and gave the Sudanese the right for self-determination, which the communists actually preached for that before. Another issue that was quite interesting from their point of view was this business with the Palestine questions. Again, they swam against the nationalist currents all over the Arab world. It was against partition. And they accepted the line dictated from Moscow for partition, and they suffered for that. Actually, the communist movement, it took a long time to recover because of persecutions by the respective governments. And at the end of the day, those governments, or the next governments, actually also followed this formula and accepted partition. But in a way, it was in the early 1950s. I think this culminated in the Bandung Conference in 1955, when Nasser actually admitted or declared that he accepted the partition plan. In Syria, the 1940s and early 1950s, we see that the left was divided between the communist movement led by the centralist figure, Khaled Bagdash, a notorious Stalinist, and the newly emerged post-World War II socialist currents, the most prominent of which was the Ba'ath Party. The latter introduced a new form of nationalist socialism, populated known as Arab socialism. Michel Aflaq and his party placed great emphasis on the ideological and doctrinal concerns. From the beginning, they expressed their objection to international communism as philosophy and as an internal force within the Arab nation. Nevertheless, the Ba'ath theoreticians actually drew a distinction between their political attitude to the Soviet Union as a great power and the attitude towards international communism. In fact, they embraced this formula called neutralism in the interbloc conflict, and so we see in the Syrian political arena in the early 1950s quite a significant trend toward this policy of neutralism, and senior politicians as well as intellectuals called to increase or to tighten relations with the Soviet Union. Communists usually acted very efficiently when they actually acted within fronts, political fronts. One such front was Harakat Ansar al-Salam, that was founded in the late 40s and early 1950s, the Partisans of Peace movement. It was a communist front organization dedicated to the disseminating of pro-Soviet propaganda, an important vehicle for furthering Soviet interests. This movement was quite efficient in Syria. For instance, the Syrian Partisans of Peace succeeded in persuading prominent Syrian politicians to sign the Stockholm Appeal in the summer of 1950. That was a call for world peace and opposition to the atomic bomb. It's actually an appeal which was made by the World Movement for Peace, a Soviet proxy. There were lots of declarations. Probably some of you heard the most shocking one at the time was the Maruf al-Dawalibi declarations in 1950 calling for a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. Basically, there was a trend toward neutralism and a policy of shifting away from any kind of close relations with the Western powers. The 1960s, the early 1960s, saw or before that, we actually witnessed the takeover by lots of countries, Arab countries, by the military. But this military was in a search for ideologies. As far as the socio-economic policy was concerned, they developed their own brand of Arab socialism. This doctrine was heavily influenced by foreign nationalist socialism in Yugoslavia and in India, and mainly these two countries. It was imported from abroad by intellectuals and politicians, but renovated to meet local Arab conditions. Arab socialism was a trickle-down phenomena, even though its rhetoric was highly populist. Gradually, the Egyptian left, independent Marxists and communists, joined the Nasserist establishment. The process culminated with the voluntary self-disintegration of the communist organization in the mid-1960s. We saw التحول الاشتراكي in Egypt, الاشتراكي in the early 1960s, the turn towards socialism. The same applied in Syria, even before the rise of the Jadid Assad group in 1966, which I won't be able to talk about short of time. And I'll just summarize, basically, the 1970s saw the decline of socialism, Arab socialism, with the change tilt towards infitah and free market economy in both, actually, particularly in Egypt, but also in Syria under Assad. The other thing is the demise of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the demise of communism in 1990 created a kind of a vacuum for the Arab left, not only the Arab left, but left worldwide. And nevertheless, I mean, socialist activities continued, as I said, to this day. And just to mention the last decade in countries like Egypt, we see a group like Kifaya, which was mentioned yesterday. Kifaya was also a front that tried to promote the idea of human rights and democracy. And that Kifaya actually had lots of leftists acting from within. I was today astonished to read that actually a new communist party was established in Egypt, or maybe it was existing before, but suddenly it became publicly known. And they were actually quite bitter that the current military regime by Tantawi, or led by Tantawi, refused to call them for consultations. I very much believe that with the new opportunity which was created following the recent event in Egypt, the Arab left has got a very good chance to re-emerge and to feel or to play a very important role. And maybe we'll witness Nahadat al-Yasar al-Misri or the Yasar al-Arabi in the following years with the formula of a kind of social democracy. But thank you very much. I'm sorry I didn't manage to pass all my insights.
Thank you very much. I read recently in Egyptian and international press the current criticism of neoliberalism that dominated the Egyptian economy in the last 2 or 3 decades, and I'm wondering whether this kind of criticism coming from the left would be able to create an alternative to the way the Egyptian economy has been run and conceptualized. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is my colleague from the Hebrew University, Dr. Meir Hatina. Meir Hatina is an assistant professor here at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. His fields are modern Islam and intellectual history in the Middle East. His recent book is titled Ulama, Politics and the Public Sphere, an Egyptian Perspective. And his talk today is titled Rethinking Arab Liberalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm mainly identified with modern Islamic thought and politics, but nevertheless, I always keep an eye on other intellectual trends, more weak and fragile, but this is the fate of a scholar who is dealing with the history of ideas. And I here would like to share with you some of my thoughts as to the Arab liberal trend in a more historical analysis, but let me start with a few notes on the recent events. The popular uprising that we are witnessing in the Arab world have led to the collapse of an entrenched paradigm regarding the endurance of authoritarian regimes. These uprisings have pointed to the political maturity of the masses, the potential of civil society in the Arab world, which until now has received little attention by most of the scholars, and to the Middle East as an integral part of a global village exposed to intensive penetration of technology, communications, and Western ideas and conceptions. Significantly, key notions in the Arab public discourse today are freedom and democracy. Although we cannot predict whether democratization will be successful, it seems obvious that there are no serious voices in the Arab world today calling for new authoritarian systems. On the contrary, the people want to assert the right of freedom, dignity, and social justice. Democratic values and institutions have always been on the modern Middle East agenda. Notably, they attained concrete substance during the early decades of the 20th century, referred to as the Liberal Age. Later on, several of the post-revolutionary regimes in the 1970s adopted partial democracy, however fragile, and publicly declared their commitment to civil rights and liberties. This is an important point, for a public commitment, even if not backed by sincere intention, is significant. It binds the regime to parameters of democratic discourse and creates an expectation for fulfillment. The current demand for democracy is not necessarily new, but rather has accrued gradually and has affected public awareness over time as a result of globalization, public declarations by rulers, and dissident agents of change. One such agent which has acquired wide attention is the Islamist, who not only demanded the implementation of the Sharia, but promoted also a civic agenda and called for the rule of law, the division of powers, honest elections, and so forth. Whether this civil agenda pointed to ideological moderation or was it only a political tactic aimed at gaining state power is an issue for another lecture. An additional agent of democratization, which by contrast has not attracted sufficient attention, is the liberal trend, which is my focus today. Thereby, I would like to do some historical justice to its followers and to question the hegemonic research narrative which has marginalized Arab liberalism, at least until the recent events. So let me start by giving some historical framework. After all, we are also historians. Historically, the Arab liberal discourse, with its core values of rationalism, civic rights, the rule of law, constitutionalism, and ecumenism, has been in a defensive position, overshadowed by the two great power that swept over the Middle East during the 20th century, the centralized state and Islamic fundamentalism. These two forces found themselves in direct confrontation, the state in striving to entrench its power and legitimacy, and the Islamists in trying to dismantle the state through evolutionary or revolutionary means. Liberalism fell between the cracks, shunned by Islamic movements and dismissed by local regimes. While both the centralist state and the Islamic fundamentalism constituted two major elements that contributed to the weakness of liberalism in the Middle East, they were not the only factor involved. Liberal constituted a poorly organized group. They lacked a coherent school of thought. They were divided by religious creed, professional training, and attitude towards Islam, the West, and Israel. Their language was too remote and rational for the common people, and they offered no attractive solution to the socioeconomic ills beyond calling for gradual reforms, both educational and political reforms. Moreover, they lacked an effective network of civil associations, not to mention political parties, which could back their cause. Many liberals were identified historically with the center of Western civilization, whose colonial history in the region was such that anyone who empathized with the Western political or cultural agenda was accused of plotting to destroy their society's indigenous identity and, in fact, constituting a fifth column. Besides dealing with vexing political challenges and with internal disunity, Arab liberalism also faced criticism in the Western academic discourse. And here I'm reaching the historiographical point. Disappointment with Arab liberals was evident in the research literature, for example, in the works of Nadav Safran and Leonard Binder, who did not conceal their frustration with a worldview that failed to meet their expectations. Binder lamented Middle East liberalism for its inability to put down roots so long as there was no solid ideological foundations for a vigorous secularism in the local political, social, and cultural systems. Other scholars gave more credit to the influence of liberalism. Albert Horani dedicated an entire book, Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, to this topic in the mid-1960s. Later, however, Horani dissociated himself from his previous definition of the term liberalism, writing, and I quote, "The European ideas which had influence were not only ideas about democratic institutions or individual rights, but also about national strength, unity, and the power of governments." End of quote. There are other scholars, I would not mention their names, Majid Khadouri and others, but still, when we are reading the works of Israel Gershoni, James Jankowski, Wael Meir, Christopher Schumann, Peter Vane, and Ovid Vashkin, we can see a more positive aspect of liberal discourse. Nevertheless, these studies were confined to the geographical scope of Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, and regrettably did not exceed the interwar period. Moreover, they did not elicit significant changes in the pessimistic assessment of Arab liberalism as being indecisive and insufficiently proactive in protesting political injustice, criticism that may be viewed as part of a more general criticism of the intellectuals in the Third World. Arab scholars who argue that the liberal phenomenon was in crisis, Azma, also contributed to this negative view. They included Abdel Allah Arawi, Issa Bulata, Hussein Alatas, Issam Sharabi, and Ibrahim Abu Rabi. The common denominator was that liberalism was elitist and cut off the masses, had no defined direction of vision, and thus left society in a state of a deadlock. In Abu Rabi's words, and I'm quoting, "Arab liberalism was a poor version of European liberalism, a cheap imitation." End of quote. Such critical and pessimistic views of Arab liberalism and its historical role, I would argue, convey impatience and a certain obsession for political results. Moreover, they are overly harsh. Apparently, the inspired ideal was that of Western intellectuals who speak truth to power, as Edward Said called it once, or alternatively, pan-Islamist nationalists and Islamists as men of action, deeply involved in politics. Indeed, the Arab liberal discourse had difficulty gaining momentum. The fall of communism in the late 1980s, which was perceived in the West as a triumph of Western democracy, incited a wave of demands for political liberalization. But, to dismay of the liberals, no real change resulted. Moreover, the first Gulf War of 1991, and mainly the second one of 2003, which ended with the American conquest of Iraq, only heightened anti-Western sentiment and exposed the liberal paradigm to growing criticism. Nevertheless, I would argue again, liberal thinking showed historical endurance, remaining a constant factor in the ideological landscape in the Arab world. Liberals reinvigorated their ideological thinking, generated debates with their enemies, and recruited new adherents, most prominently from the Arab left ranks. Moreover, while the formative liberalism of the interwar period had focused mainly on the constitution and on nationalism, post-1967 liberalism laid greater emphasis on the individual rights, social reform, and the ethics of tolerance towards the other, namely women, religious minorities, and non-Muslim cultures. The new information technologies clearly acted as facilitators. The new media, satellite communication, and the internet in particular crossed borders to propagate ideas and critical messages. The internet, introduced in the region in the early 1990s, allowed for a greater accessibility of the public and were less given to control by the political authorities than the print and the electronic media. The new media became an important stronghold of minority ideologies in the Middle East, including liberal currents. Now, I don't know if I will have time, but I would like to show a short clip, but I think I will reserve it to the last of my talk because of the harsh chairperson here. So, but nevertheless, in the long run, the contribution of the liberal community's discourse to the culture of political pluralism was twofold. It ratified the right to dissent, and it questioned the Arab status quo. While a number of Arab liberals became bitter and frustrated in view of the status as nonconformist, devoid of public appeal or political power, other liberals continued to demonstrate dissidence in incisive analysis of a wide range of issues. They were willing to pay the price for defending what they believed were sacred values, namely personal and civil rights, the division of powers, the rule of law, and no less important, the depoliticization of Islam as a means to ensure greater integration into the modern world. Writers such as Faraj Foda in Egypt and Mahmoud Muhammad in Sudan paid with their lives. Others were intimidated mainly by Islamic circles, yet continued to challenge taboos and other themes in public discourse. Writers residing outside the region, such as Wafa Sultan, Hazem Saria, George Tarabishi, and Shakir al-Nabulsi, introduced the liberal Arab message to the Western audience. Al-Nabulsi, a Jordanian writer and the most systematic of the Arab liberals, drafted even a liberal manifesto in 2004, the first attempt of its kind to produce a formative text. It consolidated varied liberal themes into a single document aimed at endowing the liberal stream with ideological coherence, thereby making it more appealing to the Arab public. Let me draw some themes from this manifesto. In this manifesto, Al-Nabulsi appointed himself as the spokesman of the new liberals. Catalyzed mainly by the attacks of the September 11th, the term new liberals had a double meaning. It emphasized the historical continuity of the liberal discourse, but also the distinctive intellectual creativity of its contemporary followers, who showed greater courage in challenging reality. The manifesto constituted of 25 principles touching on the basic issue of the Arab reality and offering a clear analysis of its paradigms. The wording of the text was incisive and dynamic, reflected in the use of such expressions as transformation, liberation, renewal, and creation. It addressed the Arab people as totality, thereby seeking to promote collective action for change. The ultimate goal was the birth of a new Arab personality, more rational, scientific, and tolerant. Al-Nabulsi's effort to enhance the ideological coherence of the liberal discourse was reinforced by later manifesto, the Rationalist Covenant, written in 2007 by Al-Afif Al-Ahdar, a Tunisian leftist who moved to Paris in the late 1970s and joined the liberal camp after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In keeping with its name, the document stressed the importance of rationalism as a tool for achieving Arab enlightenment. Rationalism, Al-Ahdar argued, is universal. Therefore, applying or imitating Western rationalism and culture should not be considered unworthy or unethical. On the contrary, it is a necessary step on the path to advancement. Only by imitating the West, the author pointed out, were nations such as Japan, South Korea, China, and India able to make a major leap forward technologically and economically. In Al-Ahdar's view, those Arab critics who denounced imitating the West were condemning their communities to ruin at the time when the world was on the threshold of a third industrial revolution centered on the information revolution and economic globalization. Al-Ahdar's document was not merely an intellectual exercise. It became the basis for the platform of the Association of Arab Rationalists, which was established in Paris in late 2007. Its declaration of principles stated its objective to reinstate a culture of criticism in Arab discourse and to advocate secularism as the ideological basis for political action. In this context, secularism was defined, and I quote, as a progressive social process whose objective is to produce an independent, open mind, civil and free democratic polity based on social ties between free men. End of quote. The impetus to defend liberalism and secularism, to distance them from any atheistic conspiracy, and to present them as an organic rather than a foreigner to indigenous culture was evident in Arab liberal discourse. This development largely reflected the success of Islamists and official clerics in instilling the notion in public discourse that secularism and atheism are synonymous. However, it did not detract from the intellectual courage of Arab liberals, who contributed to a defined discourse that demanded change in the contemporary Arab reality. Liberals also found points of affinity with Arab nationalists, leftists, mystics, and moderate Islamists who advocated deconstructing the past and defined political oppression. The civic agendas of these groups, which supported human rights, democratization, and the empowerment of civil society, contributed to the entrenchment of these concepts in the Arab public discourse, thereby indirectly advancing the liberal cause. To conclude, my aim here has been to present a more nuanced and positive nature or picture of the Arab liberal thought, which, although lacking significant public appeal and compelling political force, nevertheless has demonstrated viability. It has provided an alternative agenda regarding the relationship between individual and the state, between religion and politics, and between Islam and the West. Its three main features have been skepticism, ecumenism, and confidence in Arab advancement. Our task as historians and observers is to lend an ear to the Arab liberal voices that have emerged and which continue to empower alternative visions for Arab society. In light of the current developments in the Middle East, these alternative visions are no longer confined to intellectual sphere or to written text, but are gaining also political viability. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe if I do have a couple of minutes.
You do have 2 more minutes.
Yeah, where's Nimrod? I have poor technical skills here. So, yeah, okay. What we are about to see is a short video clip taken from Arab satellite, and the speaker is Said al-Kimni, an Egyptian writer, a very important Egyptian writer. And through this clip, we can demonstrate the effective use of the new media to convey and transmit a very vigorous liberal message aimed or targeting both Islamist and local regimes.
احنا منطقة لا تعرف الديمقراطية أصلا. يعني بره في الدول الديمقراطية الناس بتخش الانتخابات بتروح تم انتقال السلطة في سلام وأمان من الحكومة إلى المعارضة أو العكس. احنا عندنا نروح كل واحد يجهز شوية قنابل وعربيات عشان نفخخ بعض ونفجر بعض. يبقى احنا ما عندناش ديمقراطية أصلا. نحن لا نفهم الديمقراطية ولا نعرف الديمقراطية.
لكن هناك محاولات للديمقراطية دكتور قمني، هناك محاولات للديمقراطية أنتم تعرقلونها. حدث ذلك في فلسطين.
لا
ادخل لي بالموضوع.
لا مفيش محاولات. لا
دي هناك محاولات.
لا
انتخابات في فلسطين.
الصندوق ما هوش الديمقراطية. الصندوق ده علبة ازاز ما يعرفش اللي جواه ايه، بيحطوا جواه ورق. الصندوق ما هوش الديمقراطية اطلاقا. احنا شوف، احنا عندنا يتصارع علينا، نحن الفريسة يتصارع علينا صنفان: أسر حاكمة وحكومات عسكرية، أو ديكتاتورية إسلامية. في ديكتاتوريتين هم اللي بيتصارعوا علينا احنا ونحن الفريسة. مفتي الحكومة يحظر كتاب، مفتي الجماعات يحظر فيلم، ده يصادر قول، ده يصادر إنسان بحاله يقتله. المرأة بقى زي موحد، بقوا زي العساكر، تشوفوا في الشارع حتى عساكر كلهم، حولوا نسواننا الغفر من الآخر، كويس. الحكومه بتجلد اللي يروح لها يشكي لها في الاسم، بتجلده تنفخه كويس. الاسلامي هو يشرع الجلد. انا مش بتشرع الجلد، زعلان من الحكومه بتجلد ليه؟ ما هو انت تزعل من الحكومه لما تجلدك لما تكونش انت مشرع الجلد، انما الجلد شرع. تروح الجامع يهزقوك، انت المسؤول عن اللي جرى للامه. المؤمن الغلبان البسيط رايح يأدي فرض ربنا، يشيلوه طين في الجامع يا ولده ويهزقوه ويهينوه ويروحوه، هو اللي شايل كل آثام هذه الأمة والهزائم اللي حصلت له بسبب عصيان الغلبان المسكين ده. خطوط حمراء، حطوا في حاجة اسمها خطوط حمراء في الديمقراطية يا عم. الحكومة ليها خطوط حمراء، الأسر الحاكمة ليها خطوط حمراء، العسكريين لهم خطوط حمراء، الإسلاميين لهم خطوط حمراء. أنا يبقى لي خطوط حمراء؟ ما هو ما ينفعش. زي ما انت لسه قايل، دي ناس بتفتي بالبصاق وبول الجمل وبول الرسول شوف الناس دي والعمليه دي كلها، واللي ترشحوا واللي نجحوا في الانتخابات واللي نجحوهم مكانهم الطبيعي مستشفى المجانين.
حماس نظم.
This interview, of course, was recorded around 2006 or 2007, namely prior to the current event.
Right. Thank you very much. Our last speaker for this panel is Mr. Wael Abu Uksa, who's a PhD candidate in international relations at the Hebrew University. He's a research fellow at the Truman Institute. He's writing his PhD on post-1967 liberal discourse in the Arab world, supervised by Professor Avraham Sela. And he explores the limits, sources, and history of this discourse. He has an article forthcoming on the political critique and Mediterraneanism. Sorry, it's my handwriting. In Mahmoud Akrun's thought. Thank you very much. His talk today is on the two variants of Egyptian liberalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Contemporary research on liberal thought in the southern eastern countries of the Mediterranean is characterized by a variety of approaches and a diversity of definitions. In my talk, I will focus on a particular stream in the liberal thought, or rather a group of intellectuals that identify themselves with liberalism. Theoretically, I'll try to avoid the common approach and widely accepted concept of the liberal age, which was coined by Albert Hourani for the sake of tracing and outlining a certain political discourse and ideology. Such a step could exempt the methodological discussion from the generalizations in favor of a discussion about the practice and manifestations of ideas in politics. Liberalism or liberal ideology in the Arab context is a grand narrative that has manifested itself in politics and history of the modern Middle East. In Egypt's case, the liberal school was established at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, predominantly with the works of Ahmad Lutfi Said, who formulated the secular idea of Egyptian nationalism and Egyptian national sovereignty from pan-Islam, pan-Arabism, and conceptualized liberal ideology into the context of Arabic language and culture. My presentation will focus on the legacy of this political discourse in the last 2 decades in Egypt. I'll contend that for the past 20 years, Egyptian liberal ideology had witnessed 2 main trends or variants that have different attitudes around the subject of democracy. The first trend advocated democracy, challenged, criticized, and countered Mubarak's authoritarian regime, and the second range between advocating transformation to democracy through a conservative process of long-term reforms and an attitude that promoted temporal rejection of any democratic reform. Theoretically, this distinction seeks to undermine the common assumptions among scholars about the allegedly obvious connection between liberalism and democracy in the Arab context. The first trend is represented by the biographies and the works of prominent intellectuals such as Saad al-Din Ibrahim and Hazm al-Bablawi. The second is represented by institutionalized intellectuals like Abd al-Min'im Said, al-Din Hilal, or free intellectuals as Sayyid al-Qimli, which we have saw, Ma'mun Findi, and Jabir Asfour. For the lack of time, I'll focus on two representative figures from each trend. To represent the first trend, I'll discuss the works of Saad al-Din Ibrahim, and for the second, the works of Abd al-Min'im Said. Saad al-Din Ibrahim is an Egyptian-American sociologist and one of the most prominent activists of human rights and democracy in Egypt in the past 2 decades. Throughout his academic career, Ibrahim has been a professor of sociology at several universities in Egypt and in the US. Ibrahim was born in 1938 and completed his PhD in the US. He began his career as a leftist, Nasserist, and in 1966, for some unknown reason, the Egyptian authorities revoked his citizenship. After the war of 1967, he left to Jordan and participated in Palestinian militant activism. He came back to Egypt in 1975 after President Sadat's decision to restore his citizenship. During the Sadat era, Ibrahim was very critical of Sadat's policies, especially his separate peace with Israel, peace initiative with Israel. He was also critical of the Infitah policy, which liberalized the economy, and of Sadat's revocation of several democratic reforms that he had initiated before 1977, the year of the bread demonstration, or Intifadat al-Khubz. During the 80s, Saad al-Din reassessed his attitudes, especially those related to liberal democracy, and he became enchanted by promoting a revised Nasserism combined with liberal democracy. The fundamental ideological changes among Ibrahim and part of the aforementioned liberals occurred mainly during the 80s and beginning of the 90s. This era witnessed the revival of liberal political discourse that was supported by the transition of former leftist intellectuals to liberalism. Worldwide political events in the late 80s and early 90s encouraged the rise of this political stream, and at the global level, the fall of the Soviet Union was perceived by many Arab leftist intellectuals as a defeat of Marxism and subsequent triumph of liberalism. The liberal democratic model was re-universalized and revitalized during this period, and was adopted by many regimes in Eastern Europe, South America, and Africa. On a regional level, this era included a re-evaluation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the new unipolar reality on the international level, which left the United States as a sole superpower, coupled with a regional optimism that increased during the late 80s and early 90s, led to Madrid Conference in October 91 and Oslo Accords a few years later. For Ibrahim and for many other Arab former leftists intellectuals, these developments augured an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, at least theoretically. These changes have been deeply reflected in the intellectual discourse and terminology of the era. In Ibrahim's case, they manifested themselves in a book he published in 1991 titled Reconsidering Sadat's Achievements, in which he reversed and re-evaluated his past attitudes toward President Sadat and his policies. He came to support the liberal economy that Sadat has established with his Infitah policy, Sadat's relations with the West, and his decision to make peace with Israel. He also re-evaluated the pan-Arab negative perception of the Arab territorial state. This reassessment actually included a wider reflection on his works during the 90s that obviously become to be oriented toward domestic issues, subject. Through Ibn Khaldun's center, which he founded in 88, he became focused on issues of minorities, civil society, citizenship, democratization, and peacemaking. Politically, his re-evaluation of his past attitudes manifested itself in his critique of the Nasserist era and its legacy, especially the issue of militant intervention in politics. At this point, I review another biography for the sake of a comparative case study. Abdelmenem Said was born in 48, graduate from Cairo University, went to United States and finished his PhD in political science in 82. In a very similar way, Abdelmenem Said started out on the left and he moved to liberalism. Like Ibrahim, during the 90s, he became involved in Egyptian peace movement, advocated liberal democracy and civil rights, became a member of Ibn Khaldun Center, and so forth. The debate between two intellectuals during the last decade revolved around one imminent issue: the immediate quest of sustaining democracy in Egypt. The polemics around this subject among liberals had molded their behavior and relationship to the authoritarian regime, while Sa'd-Din Ibrahim challenged the regime throughout the 90s by inspecting elections, criticizing the regime's behavior throughout his Ibn Khaldun Center, and through human rights organizations. Abdelmenem Said has become part of the National Democratic Party and was one of the regime's most prominent spokesmen. From this point on, two intellectuals' paths diverged. Ibrahim's relationship with Mubarak regime deteriorated during the 90s and became confrontational in 2000 after Ibrahim published an article about the phenomena of Tawrith, or in the Egyptian case, Jamal's Mubarak ambition to inherit the presidency from his father. In this article titled "The Nation Must Add the Term Republicarchy to the political lexicon," he coined a new concept, term, Jumlukiya, or Republicarchy, that combined the words republic and monarchy. The terms denote the unique condition of inheritance of governmental authority by sons from fathers within the context of Arab republics. Since 2000, Ibrahim has faced a decade of persecution. The night his article was published, he was arrested and in May 2001 was imprisoned under the accusation of using European Union funds without governmental approval and for defaming Egypt's image abroad. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. In March 2003, and after multiple retrials, he was cleared of all charges and released. Despite this incident, he continues to challenge the regime. He criticized the regime for imprisoning the liberal politician Ayman Noor and the Islamist Sam al-Arian, supported the peaceful opposition movements, and was completely engaged in peaceful activism against the autocratic regime. On August 2008, an Egyptian court sentenced Ibrahim to 2 years in prison for defaming Egypt. He left Egypt to live in exile to avoid probable arrest upon his return. In August 2010, Ibrahim returned to Cairo but was not arrested. On the other hand, Abdelmenem Said underwent a completely different experience. In 2002, he became a member of the High Committee for Policies in the ruling party. And in 2007, he became a senator in the Shura Council. In 2009, he held the position of chairman of the board of Al-Ahram newspaper and president of Al-Ahram Center of Political and Strategic Studies. Said collected and republished the works of Ahmad Lutfi Sayyid, advocated slow democratic reforms, avoided the question of Tawrith, and attacked the regime's opponents like Kifaya movement and later Al-Baradi and so forth. He was accused by his critique of being the regime's propagandist. The practical and the biographical differences between these two influential intellectuals regarding the question of sustaining democracy were embedded in the uniqueness of the liberal condition in the Arab context. The alliance between part of the liberal intellectuals and the authoritarian regime was not built solely on personal interests and benefits, but also in ideological convictions. For many liberals, cooperation with the regime and silence about corruption scandals and falsified elections was a result of their fear of Islamists and the theocratic state, which they perceived as the worst possible option. Public polemics between the two intellectual streams about whether to legalize the engage of Islamic Brotherhood in Egyptian politics, in Egyptian political process, moved into spotlight after Sa'd-Din Ibrahim's imprisonment. His ambition to get closer to this popular group was obvious in his articles and his actions after 2003. He visited Hamas representatives in 2006 and Hezbollah leaders in 2007. He also tried to arrange a meeting between Egyptian Islamists and the leaders of the ruling party in Turkey in the hope that the Egyptians would learn from the AK their democratic experience. By this time, Ibrahim's ultimate enemy had become the Egyptian regime and not the Islamists. In one of his last interviews a year ago, he was asked, if we have an election today and you were obligated to choose between the Ikhwan and the ruling party, which would you choose? And his answer was explicit: I choose the Islamists. Ibrahim has contended in many articles since his release that the regime is using the fear of Islamists among Egyptian middle class and in his foreign relations in order to repress democracy and preserve autocracy. He captured his perception in the expression Faza'at al-Ikhwan, or the Ikhwanic scarecrow. Many liberals have criticized Ibrahim's new relationship and attitude toward the Islamists. Abdelmenem Said wrote an article in October 2007 titled "The Scarecrow is Totally Realist," contesting Ibrahim's assumption that the regime was manipulating fear of Islamists by contending that the Islamic political project is still seeking to sustain totalitarian theocracy. Based on this assumption, he linked in other articles the process of democratizing the Islamists with the process of democratizing the Egyptian ruling party, and contended that, and I'm quoting, the current process of reform in the NDP party will not be completed before reforming the other groups and parties. Sayyid al-Qimani, a prominent liberal and the most outspoken critic of Islamists, launched a much more aggressive criticism through a series of articles. In an article titled Democracy of Destruction, al-Qimani criticized Ibrahim's attitude toward the Islamists and stated that the Islamists have not changed and their demands are still fundamentally different from the case of the Turkish Islamic Democrats. He contended that they are the biggest threat to any democratic process in Egypt. Abdelmenem Said al-Qimani position on democracy in Egypt weren't the most radical among the liberals. Ma'mun Fendi, a professor of political science and one of the most prominent Egyptian scholars in the West, contended that the problem of sustaining democracy in the Arab countries is deeper than the political convictions of any political group. He contended that dictatorship is a product of the Arab culture. A failed culture produces failed societies and regimes, and the Islamists are only the symptom. He goes beyond and argued in an article published in July 2007 titled "Transparent Authoritarian," that a democratic regime cannot survive in the current Arab cultural context. For him, democracy, not simply majority rule, but a concept that is based on individual freedoms, a demand that is not realistic under the current common social norms of Arab societies. He suggested surpassing the vain discussion about democracy and dictatorship for the sake of adopting a transparent authoritarian regime like the one on Singapore. I'll conclude. In the regional context, it's important to make the distinction between liberalism and democracy, or between the demand for individual freedoms and the demand for political freedoms. The unification of these two orientations is not self-evident in the Arab contemporary political thought. Egyptian and Arab liberals intellectuals have operated until recently in an inconvenient context that is framed by two rival powers, political Islam and the autocratic state. The fear of Islamists has long shaped the liberal attitudes toward the question of democracy and autocracy. Contemporary liberals have faced the current revolutionary changes in Egypt without a unified vision, while they stand in two separate camps, those who already been marked as being part of the old regime and those still hoping to fulfill an influential role in the new order. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I thought I was reminded by Mahmoud Darwish's comments on whether it would be better to be Sartre or André Malraux in the de Gaulle's government. Anyway, what we have now, Nimrod will agree 20 minutes for questions. Copy.
Thank you all for this interesting panel. First, a comment for the first speaker, Dr. Haugbolle. You mentioned in the beginning of your talk, Sheikh Imam. I would like to comment that Sheikh Imam was only the voice, because the lyrics and the messages were not written by him, they were written by a poet, the poet Ahmad Fuad Nigam, and they were only performed by Sheikh Imam, who was popular, but the messages were created by Ahmad Fuad Nigam, who is still alive and still active. By the way, there are a few works written about Ahmad Fuad Nigam, at least one book that I saw in Arabic about Sheikh Imam. Also, about these messages on the left, these songs, or kind of songs, were very popular all over the Arab world. I know that they are also popular among Arabs in Israel. And there is no connection to left-wing or right-wing messages, but because there are protests and the protest against the government, against many things. One of the famous songs of Ahmad Fuad Nigam is Mawal al-Ful wal-Lahma, which is still an issue in Egypt even today, and it is often quoted without any connection to left and right. To Professor Ginat from Conversations with Egyptians, last week in Cairo, I understand that people are now following the new situation in Egypt, trying to get organized in new political parties, and we may see in the near future small political parties. I will not surprise if there will be one leftist party, although I'm not sure that it will call itself left, because the word left is not very popular today. And to Dr. Hatina, you mentioned Elmania, which is a problematic term today, compared with atheism. And you are right, I heard from people who are involved in getting organized that they are for Ilmania, but they are not going to say it openly, and they are looking for bypassing terms like we support equality and things like that, which will mean if, not openly that they are Ilmania, but they will not say it. It also because what you say that it may carry bad connotations today. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah.
It is very interesting to hear from this young generation about ideology. What is ideology? Can you imagine, perhaps historically, ideology, what is before the Second World War? Ideology before the Second World War, ideology after, I don't know what it is, whether there is a relation or just ideology is starting just newly. So if the new generation will have ideology in many things, in the thing that you lecture today, in the world it will be peace and progress.
Thank you. Rami.
Are we noticing the Arab left in a new dress? Because I noticed from what all of you had said that there was a trend towards from communism and Marxism of the 60s and 70s towards liberalism since the 90s. So what is left of the Arab left if they all turn liberals now? I mean, there's a very few Marxist discourse going on around, and from the people I know in Palestine or Israel, it's a bit, discourse, anti-Taific discourse, ardent Watani nationalism, the symbols of wearing certain things and sitting in certain coffee shops, and probably the Yasari label that they still have. What is left of the Arabic left? They're all liberals now.
Okay. I think, yeah, I think we have a time for answers, and then if we have any more time for another round, we'll do that. So,
Thanks. These are good comments, all of them. In between chaos. Yeah, of course, Ahmed Fuad Negim is the man behind, but somehow Sheikh Imam has become the symbol. I mean, he's the one who's sort of celebrated, but the poet is the important. And I also noticed that he took part in the demonstrations, and so these words that were coined in the 70s have a meaning still. To the gentleman about ideology in the 30s, the interesting thing about ideology is that it kind of comes in waves. So the experience with ideology in the early part of the 20th century was largely negative, you can say. So there was a reaction after the Second World War of a kind of what historians would say a post-ideological phase, where people reacted against ideology as something bad. And I think you can see the same in the 90s, after the fall of the Cold War. And this is where perhaps liberalism comes in. So we imagine that the 90s is a period where, since the 90s, where liberalism becomes sort of the global dominant ideology. And to be honest, if you look at the Arab liberals, what they don't do, that I think Arab leftists do, is that they don't focus very much on, let's say, a materialist reading of history. They don't focus very much on criticism of the means of production and the economy, and therefore they don't link it very much to social justice issues. And I think this is where the Arab left is something different. And they're not perhaps as visible to us, But I've argued this now several times at this conference. I think part of the reason is that we haven't focused very much on them. I believe they're there, and I think the proof is in the pudding, as they say. You know, look at the demonstrations. I think a lot of this was formulated not just as liberalism, but also in what you can call leftist terms. But we do need to discuss a little bit more also amongst ourselves, if we're not cutting too, let's say, neatly cut out categories between leftists and liberals here. Does that have to be something different? I think being democratic, being liberal, being secular, being leftist, these are positions, and any individual can take those positions, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive, to my mind.
As for the current situation in Egypt, will a new left emerge? It's a good question. What we see, as you mentioned, Gabi, there are lots of suddenly lots of organizations, lots of groups. Suddenly, everybody's trying to kind of come up with some new platform and play in the newly established democratic game, at least at the moment. And I do believe that the left, under the current socio-economic conditions of countries like Egypt, still have to play a significant role, because when I'm talking now on what we are going to hopefully see in the near future, a democratic system, and I believe that a social democratic party will be able to play its role, and I can't see at the moment any elected government succeeding in sorting out the major economic and social difficulties that Egypt faces at the moment, and faced in the past as well. So I believe that there is a place for left, and if you look at all these people that your brilliant lecturers, people like Saadeddin Ibrahim and Abdelmunam Said, they all started in the left, and then with the vacuum that was created with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, they shifted towards alternatives ideologies, and liberalism was one of them. But I still think that there is some place for a left, and we'll obviously will see something coming up in the near future. Even in Syria, the Communist Party, the final vestiges of the Communist Party, actually decided in 2005 to become a social democratic party. So there is a place for social democracy in the Arab world, and I hope so. Something like this will happen. Ideologies, I'm a firm believer in ideologies, and I think you should never measure ideologies in the size of the adherents or the size of the organizations, but ideologies actually the very, very influential force in determining socio-economic and political directions in the 20th century is actually can tell us very clearly. Thank you. Meir.
Thank you. As for Gabi's comment, where is he? You have a point about not using the term, or explicitly the term Ilmania, but in the text that okay, but in the text that I worked on and explored, you can see an explicit use of the term Ilmania, not just by the Arab rationalists that I mentioned in my talk, but also if you take the platform of Al-Mustaqbal Party established by Faraj Foda already in 1992, you can see the term coined in this text. But I agree, you have the term, but the content is more cautious and more moderate, of course, given the circumstances.
People who believe in it,
yeah.
but they don't want to use it.
Okay. No, you have a point. But as for the question by Ronen, what is left from the Arab left, you also have a point, also concerning the fact that key figures of the Arab left passed away, Lutfi al-Huli and recently Fuad Zakaria. Of course, this is a paradigm that is quite eroded in recent years, but still there are advocates and adherents of this ideology. And more so, those who converted to liberalism brought with them the socio-economic themes into the liberal discourse and turned it more social rather than just political democracy, but also just an egalitarian vision. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I wanted to ask something about the conceptual terms or even the perception of what left is. I mean, there was some almost lyrical questions asked here about what is left of the left. And I was asking Dr. Hatina before and concerning something, an example which is not in the Middle East, the example of the two Koreas, which is, I think, an example of two countries, one, the northern one, being some form of let's say, a communism turned into a totalitarianism, standing against the South, which is liberal, and it's an example of left being in opposition to liberal to a certain extent, and it brings to my mind at least the question of trying to attach identities to the left and two notions of liberalism. Are they free of political stands, or are they not? I mean, another thing that comes to mind is, that's actually my question, regarding the Shiites in Iraq forming a new government and being pressurized by the Sunnis as a minority, but not only as a minority, also representing an imposed rule of the West. Whether they can be identified with liberalism or identified with leftism, what is the relationship there? Thank you.
Any other comments? If I may, just a small comment. I think that getting back again to the question of categories, when you think of liberalism as a political ideology and then about neoliberalism as an economic system, which is under criticism from the current revolution, I think when we think about left and right and where we're standing today, I think things are getting confusing and interesting. So who would like to comment on the last question? Or?
I'd like maybe Meir first. I think it was directed. Okay. No, actually, let Meir start. I'm not quite sure what to say.
I have to think first. Asher, I agree with you. I mean, using the term liberalism and left, those are vague terms. But if you will look at the Western continent or case, you can find also ambiguity and ambivalence in those terms. There was a recent survey that shows that among 25 or so countries, liberalism was implemented fully only in part of these countries, and the other were a combination of liberal and even authoritarian tendencies. So it's not just prevailing in our region, but also in the West, where the democracy and liberalism were formatively established. So, I don't know.
Okay, Sune?
I think the question is very important because it's about categories, and you know it's a methodological question, because do we as scholars go out and say this is liberal, and these are the things that are characterized as a liberal individual or liberal movement, and then we go and find them, or do we accept that liberalism and leftism can be formulated in different ways? So do we look at the way that people themselves formulate these things? I think concerning the Arab left, we have to make it very clear that the Arab left has a history which is very has big authoritarian streaks and very anti-liberal streaks. And when you look at people who call themselves leftists today, a big part of the project for them is to reevaluate that history and to try to break with it in a way. Try to also understand what went wrong in their own ideological strain. For example, there's a Syrian writer who's written a book called Abi al-Baathi, My Dad the Baathist, which is, I can't remember the name of the author, but it's a wonderful sort of attempt to see why his father became a Baathist in the first place, trying to understand the good things about that sort of ideological call, but also trying to understand what went wrong with that and how it went down a road where you ended up with al-Assad in power for years and years. So this would be my answer, that there are, attempts within these groups of people to reflect on their own positions. And I think this is deeply interesting. This is when it becomes very interesting. It's less interesting that we say this is a liberal, then we go out and find them with a tweezer.
Just one word, when you try to define the left is something that is covered in a very, very wide spectrum. And it's a shifting paradigm which accommodates itself to changing socioeconomic conditions and situations, realities. So you may define nowadays a leftist in a completely different term compared to what it was in the 20s or the 30s.
So I think we have a lot to talk about over coffee. I think our time is up. So, right, Nimrod? Our time is up. Thank you. So if we have further questions, we definitely can discuss it over coffee. Thank you very much for very interesting talks and very interesting discussion.